Something happened in the early hours of this morning that the Kremlin desperately does not want you to see. At 2:10 in the morning, a Russian drone punched through Ukrainian air defenses and slammed into the container reception building at Ukraine's centralized spent nuclear fuel storage facility. Let that settle for a moment. Russia just struck a nuclear site, not a power plant, not a reactor, but a facility that holds the spent nuclear fuel from multiple Ukrainian power stations. Energoatom confirmed the hit. The IAEA, whose monitors were physically present on site and heard the explosion, confirmed the strike. Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed structural damage. Confinement capability compromised. And yet, in a detail that should both reassure you and terrify you at the same time, radiation levels remained within normal limits. No spent fuel was in the damaged building. No casualties among personnel. But here is what I need you to understand as someone who spent a career studying how wars escalate. This is not an accident. This is not a stray drone that got lost in the dark. This is a calculated message from Moscow, and the message is chilling. But before we get to what that message means strategically, I have to tell you about what Ukraine was doing at the exact same time Russia was sending drones toward that nuclear facility. Because while Russian drones were crossing into Ukrainian airspace headed for a nuclear site, Ukrainian drones were flying nearly 1,000 kilometers in the opposite direction, all the way to St. Petersburg. And what they found when they got there is going to reshape how every Western military analyst thinks about this war. Let's go back to the beginning of this week to understand the full scope of what is now happening. Because what you are watching right now is not a series of random attacks. This is a coordinated strategic campaign unlike anything we have seen since this war began, and the timing is not coincidental. On June 3rd, Ukrainian long-range drones struck the St. Petersburg oil terminal and set it ablaze. Not near St. Petersburg, in St. Petersburg, in Putin's hometown. On the opening day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the event that Putin personally uses every single year to project an image of Russia as a stable, investable, powerful nation. Black smoke rose over the port. Foreign dignitaries arrived to the smell of burning crude, and the Kremlin had no answer. Russian air defenses, which Moscow has spent billions building and which it claims are the most sophisticated in the world, failed to stop a Ukrainian drone from lighting up the skyline of the second largest city in Russia. That was June 3rd. Now fast forward to the night of June 6th, going into June 7th, and Ukraine did it again. Bigger, bolder, more precise. And this time they did not just go after the oil terminal. They went after the Russian Baltic Fleet itself. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, working in a coordinated joint operation with the Unmanned Systems Forces and the Security Service of Ukraine, launched a massive long-range drone strike against Kronstadt. If you are not familiar with Kronstadt, let me give you the military context because this matters enormously. Kronstadt is an island fortress in the Gulf of Finland, just west of St. Petersburg. It has been the historic home of Russia's Baltic Fleet for centuries. It houses warships, submarines, training centers, repair docks, and shipbuilding facilities. And because Ukraine destroyed so much of Russia's Black Sea Fleet capability over the last 2 years, sinking or disabling flagship vessels, forcing the fleet to retreat from Crimea, the Kremlin has quietly shifted strategic naval importance toward the Baltic. Kronstadt's significance in the Russian military calculus has been growing, and Ukraine just struck it, twice in 1 week. Smoke rose above the Kronstadt marine plant. Fires were confirmed at the naval base itself. And then came the strike that may matter more than all of it combined. The Russian Navy's 15th arsenal in the settlement of Bolshaya Izhora in the Leningrad region was hit. I want you to understand what the 15th arsenal is, because when I read the intelligence description of this facility, I had to stop and reread it. This is a strategic facility responsible for storing, repairing, maintaining, and disposing of naval munitions, torpedoes, and missile systems for the Russian Baltic Fleet. Think about that. Ukraine just struck the primary weapons storage and maintenance hub for Russia's entire Baltic Fleet naval arsenal. Explosions were reported. The village of Bolshaya Izhora was ordered to evacuate, and the Ukrainian channel Exelinova Plus, which has documented Russian military facilities throughout this war with extraordinary accuracy, described the strike as part of the planned demilitarization of Leningrad and Russia. And that same night, almost simultaneously, Ukraine hit the Petergovskaya oil depot in the city of Lomonosov near St. Petersburg, and the Neste oil terminal, also in Lomonosov, and an oil depot in Ust-Labinsk, deep in Krasnodar Krai, roughly 500 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, a facility that Ukraine's own security services described as a key rear logistics hub for storing and supplying fuel to Russian forces on the southern and eastern front. 60 residents were evacuated from surrounding homes. Fires burned through the night. Now let me stop here for a moment, because I want to give you my honest assessment of what this week represents strategically. When I look at the totality of these strikes, and I spent 30 years in uniform studying exactly this kind of operational planning, what I see is not opportunistic targeting. This is a coherent, deep strike campaign designed to accomplish three simultaneous objectives. First, degrade Russian logistics, fuel depots, naval ammunition arsenals, oil terminals. Every one of these targets either directly supplies Russian forces on the front line or generates the revenue Moscow needs to keep funding this war. Second, erode Russian strategic confidence. Striking Putin's hometown twice in 4 days during his flagship economic showcase, in front of the foreign investors and dignitaries he is trying to court, that is not just kinetic warfare. That is psychological warfare at the highest level. You are telling the Russian elite, you are telling Moscow's business class, you are telling every foreign CEO who flew in for that forum, nowhere in Russia is safe, not even here. Third, demonstrate capability overmatch. 1,000-kilometer drone strike. Think about that number. Ukraine is hitting targets nearly the distance from Washington to Chicago. And Russia's air defenses, despite claiming to have shot down over 140 drones over the Leningrad region alone, could not stop the ones that mattered from finding their targets. But here is where it gets even more complicated, because while Ukraine was executing this extraordinary deep strike campaign, Russia was doing its own killing. And the contrast between the two countries' target selection in these 24 hours tells you everything you need to know about the fundamental moral distinction in this war. Russia sent drones into Ukraine and struck a nuclear waste storage facility. Let me say that again so there is no ambiguity. Russia deliberately targeted a site containing spent nuclear fuel from Ukrainian nuclear power plants. The IAEA's own personnel, who were physically on site, heard the explosion. Director General Grossi confirmed the strike, confirmed structural damage, confirmed the confinement capability of the building was compromised. And this is not the first time. In February of 2025, a Russian strike hit the confinement structure at the same facility. Now in June of 2026, they are back. The IAEA has already warned that this pattern of strikes, each one individually falling just short of causing a radiological emergency, is collectively eroding the safety margins that protect millions of people across Ukraine and Europe. The French foreign minister put a price tag on the first strike's damage alone, $550 million to repair. And as of this weekend, comprehensive restoration remains incomplete. Russia knows exactly what it is doing. It is playing nuclear roulette with the lives of European civilians. And every time it escapes without a radiological release, it rolls the dice again. Russia also struck Ukraine's Sumy region with guided aerial bombs and drones early this morning, killing at least one man. It attacked the Zaporizhia region with drones, injuring 7 people. It hit Dnipropetrovsk region, causing fires. It struck a factory building in Poltava. And critically, it used drones to attack 2 boats of the Maritime Search and Rescue Service that were carrying out a humanitarian mission within Ukraine's maritime corridor. Civilian search and rescue boats. There are casualties. Ukrainian Navy vessels moved in to begin evacuation. And at the same time Russia was hitting civilian targets across Ukraine, something quietly devastating was happening at the front that very few people are talking about this morning. But they should be. Ukraine's precision strike campaign against Russian logistics is starting to produce measurable, concrete effects on Russian combat power. Here is the intelligence that came out in the last 24 hours, and it is significant. The command of the Russian 36th Army has imposed ammunition usage limits on its own artillery units for the month of June. This is not a rumor. This was confirmed by Vladislav Voloshin, the spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces, in a direct statement to Ukrinform. The reason? Ukrainian armed forces struck Russian ammunition depots in the temporarily occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, and the 36th Army simply does not have enough shells left to let its artillery fire freely. It is rationing ammunition in the middle of an active combat month. Now, I want to take a moment and explain why this is actually more significant than any single drone strike, because this is the kind of detail that gets lost in the daily headlines, but that fundamentally changes battlefield dynamics. Artillery is the primary killing tool in this war. Roughly 80% of casualties on both sides are attributed to artillery fire. When a Russian army command tells its artillery units, you have a monthly limit on how many shells you can fire, it does not just reduce the number of explosions. It reduces the suppression of Ukrainian infantry movements. It reduces the ability to contest Ukrainian artillery positioning. It reduces the volume of fire that Ukrainian defenders have to endure when they hold the line. It is a force multiplier working in Ukraine's favor without a single additional Western weapon system being delivered. Ukraine hit the depots, the shells are gone, the guns go quiet. And when the guns go quiet, Ukrainian forces can move. This is exactly the kind of deep logic operational thinking that Ukraine's military has been applying with increasing sophistication throughout this year. And it is working. The Russian 36th Army is rationing. That is a battlefield reality, not a talking point. Meanwhile, today, June 7th, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces launched what Commander Robert Magyar Brovdy described as a coordinated strike wave hitting 26 Russian military, energy, and logistics targets across occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Crimea, and the Bryansk region inside Russia itself. 26 targets in a single operational night. This is not reactive. This is systematic dismantlement of Russia's rear area infrastructure. And here is the diplomatic context that makes all of this even more loaded. These strikes came the day after Vladimir Putin rejected President Zelensky's peace proposal. Zelensky had done something unusual earlier this week. He wrote an open letter directly to Putin, offering a personal meeting and proposing a truce. Putin rejected it, and within hours, Ukrainian drones were flying toward Kronstadt. The message from Kiev was unmistakable. We tried the diplomatic door, you slammed it shut. So here is what comes next. Trump weighed in on the sidelines, telling reporters he wants Zelensky and Putin to sort this out themselves. That statement, that single careless line from the President of the United States, is itself a strategic signal, and not a reassuring one for Ukraine's European partners. European officials have been explicit in recent days. Moscow's escalating aggression is a direct result of the increasing difficulties Russia is facing militarily and economically. In other words, Putin is hitting harder because he is losing ground, burning through ammunition, watching his naval arsenal go up in flames, and hemorrhaging troops at a rate now running over 1,300 killed or wounded every single day, according to Ukrainian military data. Russia lost over 1,300 troops and over 2,000 drones in a single day on June 6th alone. Let me put that attrition number in human terms for a moment, because I think it is easy to let large numbers wash over you without really absorbing what they mean. Russia is losing the equivalent of an infantry battalion in killed and wounded approximately every 3 days. Day after day, week after week, month after month. And despite that, the Kremlin keeps sending men forward. The UN Security Council held an emergency session this week after Russia's large-scale strike on Ukraine. Nothing came of it. The veto remains. The killing continues. But here is what I keep coming back to as I assess all of this. Ukraine is demonstrating in real time that it can reach the entirety of Russian territory. There is no sanctuary. From Crimea to Kronstadt, from Krasnodar to Moscow's suburbs, Ukrainian drones are arriving. And the question that every Russian military planner now has to live with is not whether Ukraine can reach their bases. They just proved they can. The question is which base is next. And now I want to give you something that I think very few commentators are willing to say directly. The strike on the nuclear waste facility this morning changes the calculus of this war in a way that demands a Western response, not just a statement. When Russia begins systematically targeting nuclear infrastructure, and the pattern is now documented, it is not disputed, the IAEA has confirmed 2 strikes on the same facility within 16 months. The threshold for international intervention should be moving. The IAEA has warned explicitly that these strikes are eroding the safety margins protecting European civilians. Not Ukrainian civilians, European civilians. This is a continent-wide security issue dressed in the language of a bilateral conflict. And the continued tendency of Western governments to treat each Russian escalation as an isolated incident rather than part of a deliberate, documented, escalatory pattern is itself a strategic failure. I have spent my career watching how adversaries test boundaries. What Russia is doing right now is not bold improvisation. It is a deliberate probing campaign to see how far it can push before the West responds in kind. Each strike on nuclear infrastructure that goes unpunished tells Moscow, go further. Each rejected peace proposal that ends with Western leaders shrugging tells Kiev, you are alone. Neither of those signals leads to a shorter war. And yet, Ukraine is still here, still fighting, still launching a 1,000-kilometer drone strike on the very night Russia bombs their nuclear facility, still adapting, still finding ways to hit harder, reach farther, and impose costs on a country with 3 times Ukraine's population and vastly greater industrial capacity. The Ukrainian military's operational creativity over the last 12 months, and I say this as someone who has commanded large formations and studied military innovation at the institutional level, is genuinely extraordinary. They are outthinking a larger opponent, and the results are showing up in Russian ammunition rationing orders, in burning fuel depots, in a naval arsenal going up in flames 1,000 kilometers behind the front. The war right now is in a phase that historians will look back on as a pivotal transition point. Russia is escalating its strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, nuclear sites, and humanitarian vessels because the front line is stalling, because Ukrainian medium-range strikes are hitting depots and the shells are running short, because a fleet that was supposed to dominate the Black Sea is now sheltering in the Baltic, and even the Baltic is no longer safe. And Ukraine is escalating its deep strike campaign because it understands something fundamental about this war. Russia cannot be negotiated with from weakness. The only language that produces results is the language of burning oil terminals and exploding ammunition depots. So here is where we are as the sun rises on June 7, 2026. Russia struck a nuclear waste facility in the dark hours of this morning. The IAEA confirms it. Europe should be furious. Ukraine struck Kronstadt, the 15th Naval Arsenal, oil depots from St. Petersburg to Krasnodar, and 26 additional targets across occupied and Russian territory. Russia's 36th Army is rationing artillery shells because its depots are gone. Russian troops are dying at a rate of over 1,300 a day, and the Kremlin is sending more. The diplomatic door was opened by Zelensky and slammed shut by Putin, and Trump told both sides to figure it out themselves. This is the state of the war right now. Not a frozen conflict, not a stalemate. A conflict escalating on every axis simultaneously, militarily, strategically, and now with today's nuclear facility strike, in ways that carry radiological risk for a continent. The next 72 hours will tell us whether the international community has the clarity and the will to respond to what Russia just did, or whether, as has happened so many times before in this war, the world will issue a statement, hold a meeting, and wait to see what Russia does next. But I want to leave you with one more thought, because it connects everything we discussed today into a single strategic truth being dangerously underappreciated in Washington and Brussels. What Ukraine has demonstrated over the past 7 days is something that no NATO war game fully anticipated even 3 years ago. A mid-sized nation with limited industrial capacity, fighting a nuclear-armed adversary on its own soil, has developed the capability to project sustained offensive power deep into that adversary's strategic rear. Not once, not as a one-off surprise, but repeatedly on consecutive nights with increasing precision and scale. From a naval arsenal to a fuel terminal to an ammunition depot, all within the same operational week. The implications for deterrence theory, for NATO planning, for the entire architecture of how we think about future conflict are profound. Ukraine has proven that the era of sanctuary for rear area logistics is over. Any future adversary watching this war must now understand that deep strike drone campaigns, when properly resourced and intelligently directed, can reach anything, anywhere. That is a lesson with consequences that extend far beyond Ukraine. And it is one that Vladimir Putin, sitting in St. Petersburg surrounded by the smell of burning crude from his own city's terminals, is learning the hard way. I will keep watching closely. I will keep analyzing every development, and I will be right back the moment something significant emerges on the ground, because in this war, that moment is never very far away.